Have you ever found yourself looking at your child's emotional outbursts and thinking, this doesn't make any sense, or what are they so upset about? It's not that big a deal. If so, well, you are certainly not alone. As parents, we often feel as though we're walking on eggshells, or we avoid taking our children out in fear of emotional meltdown, which can be embarrassing, upsetting, and can lead to some pretty big emotions for us parents as well. Today's video will help us understand a little more about why our kids express their emotions in such big ways and some strategies for responding skillfully to these situations. My name is Victoria Kettis. I'm a mom of two and a director of programs here at Family Smart. Big emotions impacted many days of being a parent when my children were young, and I wish I would have had the knowledge of why my kids were having big emotions and what I could have done to show up for them in ways that would have been more helpful. So we are glad you're here so we can all learn together. I would like to welcome Nicole Allen to share some insights that can make a big difference in how we support our kids and ourselves with big emotions.
Thank you, Victoria. Today we're talking about this deepening our understanding of emotion regulation and how to support our young people with their big emotions. As always, I'm thrilled to be partnering with Family Smart to create this resource for families. It's the resource that I wish I had had as a young parent, and I hope that it's helpful in part for many of the viewers. I want to take a moment and be really explicit about saying that no two families are the same. And no one in the history of the world has ever raised your children or struggled with the day-to-day challenges exactly as they present with your child and your family. I want to be really clear that the concepts, that I'm going to be talking about today are really rooted in a Western construct of psychological concepts and attachment theory, and in no way are they meant to challenge or replace the cultural or social or relational practices of your family. And please engage with whatever the information is in a way that's comfortable for you. If some of it feels like it's a little bit more relevant for you, that's wonderful. If some of it feels like, yeah, that's not going to work for us or for our family, please just move on from it, and maybe it will be of use to someone else. So everyone is welcome here, and I'm so glad that you're joining us. It's really hard to understand when our children have really, really big emotions. And this can really call upon us as parents, but as human beings in those moments. When we're around someone who has a big outburst or a big expression of emotion, it's normal that draws upon or awakens something within us. Often we can feel, if it's our child, we can feel embarrassed, or we can feel ashamed, or we can feel angry, or scared sometimes too, right? Or we can fear the judgment of others or the judgment of what we think other people might be thinking of us, whether they're thinking it or not. So we're going to talk about three main things to start with in terms of how do we sort of position ourselves from a place of understanding exactly what's happening for our child. Sometimes it's a little bit hard when we talk about intense emotions. It's really normal for families that feel maybe overwhelmed or that they've tried everything to feel like, just tell me the strategy, just tell me what to do, A, B, and C, so that this problem isn't a problem anymore. And I really sincerely wish that there was something that I could offer that was that clear. But as we've said, nobody in the history of the world has raised your children. Nobody in the history of the world has come to parenting in the way that you come to parenting. And so that sort of an answer isn't that easily structured. The best that we can do is start to understand what's happening for our child in this moment and what's happening for us in this moment. And this is a concept that's called attunement. And basically, attunement means we ask the question, what does this child need in this moment? It can be quite different from what their siblings have needed in terms of managing their emotions. It can be very different from what we have needed or from what our child's peers tend to need in these moments. And so just by being able to step back out of it and say, what has worked in other situations might not work for this child in this moment, allows us to step back and take a breath and say, how do I approach this particular moment? it can help us to really cut through a lot of that chatter of the expectations and the fears and the worries that we can be having about our child and just be able to really zone in and say, what is my child feeling in this moment? And how can I respond to that in a loving way? So that's attunement. I also want to be really clear that emotions and behavior are very, very different things. And sometimes when we're talking about emotion regulation, sometimes when our kids have really big emotions, we confuse those two very separate things. And in our attempt to manage the behavior, which is sometimes problematic or even dangerous, um, we tend to want to quash the emotion that's happening. And what we do in that moment is we really deprive our children of the opportunity to learn how to more skillfully manage that emotion. And we interrupt the processing of that emotion from beginning to end. Think of it like if we're seeing a train going through a tunnel and it's dark tunnel and it's going through very fast and it's going through very loud, and we can become quite overwhelmed by just how intense that feels. If we interrupt the train in the middle of the tunnel, that can do more harm than good. And we deprive our kids of learning that they will come out the other side. We also deprive ourselves of noticing we're going to come out the other side when the situation is really intense. And so we want to make sure that in our mind, we're always responding to what the emotion is in terms of we're not quashing the emotion, but we may very well need to manage or shape the behavior that's happening. So we're going to talk about some really specific strategies about what that looks like. Dr. Becky Kennedy is a fantastic resource for parents. She has a book and a website called Good Inside. And she talks a lot about this difference between emotions and behavior and how we can support the healthy emotion regulation skills in our child. So if that's a resource you're looking for, I think she's on Instagram as well. So Dr. Becky Kennedy, she says the only way that you can learn to regulate a feeling is through feeling the feeling. And what can really happen with a lot of young people is if that processing of that emotion from start to finish is interrupted, they learn to be afraid themselves of these big emotions because they don't believe that they can process that emotion or manage that emotion. It becomes as scary for them as it becomes for us, and they don't learn how to be more adaptive in a healthy way. They just learn that when the intensity of the emotion starts to happen, that it's scary, and often that can be quite explosive. And finally, the reason why we spend so much time supporting parents to understand what is this behavior and how do we make sense of it is because the more we can invite parents to have an understanding of what they're seeing in terms of what's happening in their child's brain and what's happening in terms of how we learn how to manage emotions, the more parents can step away from some labels on that behavior, which can really interfere in terms of learning how to coach a healthy emotion. And we want to support parents to better be able to understand what it is they're seeing so that they're not afraid of it and they see it as an opportunity for coaching healthy adaptive management of emotions, healthy adaptive behavioral responses to it. And sometimes we see some of those that labels being assigned to both the behavior and the emotion as disrespectful or defiant or manipulative. These are just some of the terms that it's really quite common to hear as descriptors of their child's behavior, but none of these speak to their child's emotional reality in those moments. And that's where it's problematic. When we can understand the emotion that's happening, that's driving some of this behavior, we can come at it, like really position ourselves in a different way, in a way that's more self-compassionate for ourselves and compassionate for our child in terms of understanding that this is a brain under construction, and that they are learning and that there are opportunities here to model and to coach what effective emotion regulation looks like. It also really presents it as quite an opportunity for us to be able to see our role in that moment. Often parents feel quite helpless or disempowered when their child's emotions and their behavior is quite escalated. But this really invites parents to lean in and say, this is a teachable, coachable moment, and you are needed here. And we're going to talk about some specific strategies for what that looks like. In our talk today, I'm talking about our, excuse me, a cup metaphor. And this isn't about the cup being half empty or half full. This is about the cup representing our capacity to cope. And so I invite you to think about your child, different ages. That cup can be different sizes, right? In very young children, that cup is quite small. It doesn't take very much for that cup to be overfilling. As we get older, generally speaking, our cups get a little bit larger. Our capacity for how much room we have in our cup gets a little bit greater. But there's a lot of factors that interfere with, or not even so much interfere, but can interfere, but affect how much capacity or how much room we have left over in our cup for just the stuff that shows up on a random day. I've lost my keys. I have to study for this test. I forgot that this assignment is due tomorrow. I had a fight with my girlfriend today. I had my friends were ignoring me today. All of those little things, these are drops in your child's cup that take up their capacity to cope. So, whereas on one day, maybe they cope reasonably well and there's not a big outburst, on another day, depending on what else is going on and taking up space in their cup, they might already be at maxed capacity. So, when you ask them to unload the dishwasher or to put their school bag away or to help out with their chores, there's a huge explosion. And on another day, that wouldn't happen. And it's hard to make sense of the behavior unless we understand, oh, that's just their capacity has been exceeded. Their capacity to cope has been exceeded. So we're going to talk about this cup metaphor. And specifically in our next slide, we're going to talk about what are some of the things that take up space in that cup. And I invite you to think about not just what is taking up space in my child's cup today, what is taking up space in your own cup today and on an ongoing basis. So many words on this slide, I do know, but again, please just engage in whatever way feels comfortable for you. Broadly speaking, there's three main categories of what fills up our cup. Biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. Biological factors, and all of these can come and go, right? They're not always the same every single day, but some of these can include your physical health. Are you feeling well? Are you recovering from an illness? Do you have chronic pain? Do you have a sense of physical fitness? Do you feel like well in yourself? Does your child feel healthy in their body? Are they hungry or thirsty? What's that phrase, being hangry? Like that's a very real thing. Are they getting adequate sleep? Recent studies show that something like 85% of young people under the age of 25 actually are not getting enough sleep. They are clinically sleep deprived. And think about what that's like as a new parent with, just a newborn, and people are just hanging on, right? They are not getting adequate sleep. What that looks like for a lot of our young people is that their capacity to cope is the same as a parent of a newborn, and they are just barely hanging on in terms of their ability to skillfully respond to things. That increases irritability and frustration and just their feeling that they can cope with what's going on in their lives. Sometimes medication, whether starting medication, ending medication, or if we're on it long term, just the effect that it has on us. Our genetics can play a role here, right? Also hormonal factors. And often parents, when they have a young person whose behavior is escalating or there's a lot going on, they're really quick to say it's the hormones that are happening. And I want to invite you to notice hormones certainly can play a role, but they are one fraction of the bigger picture of what's going on. Substance use can play a role as well. Neurodiversities, things like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, or any kind of neurodiversity, whether or not it meets the criteria for a diagnosis of anything. Sometimes people are just, I think in my day, we would just say quirky, right? Or we, just sort of go to the beat of their own drum. Some kids just struggle with some things a little bit more than others, even when that doesn't meet criteria for a diagnosis. And this is just things that can contribute to taking up capacity in their cup. And finally, other social or communication challenges, again, whether or not they meet criteria for a diagnosis of anything in particular. In a psychological sense, this is chronic stress, cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to look at things from different perspectives and say, this is the way I'm looking at it, but there might be other reasons for why this thing is happening. If we're not able to have cognitive flexibility, if we're quite rigid in that, that can really take up a lot of space in our cup. Whether we have underlying or untreated mental health concerns like depression or anxiety or PTSD, or whether we've experienced significant life changes either in the past or more recently, or whether we're anticipating those coming up, like a move in home or a breakdown of relationships or friendships or parental relationships, the death or accident or injury of a friend or a family member, or whether there's parental conflict or conflict within the adults in a child's life, or any big transition. If there's academic or work pressure or stress, if there's relationship conflict or pressure, if there's experience of traumatic events, and traumatic events can be whatever feels like a before and after event in terms of creating our worldview. What's traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic for somebody else. That's really a very personal sort of a thing. But if your child feels like there's been a before and after event in their life, if there's financial stress or food insecurity, these things all contribute to our sense of psychological well-being. And the more of these worries we have, the more space is taken up in our cup. If every one of these things is a drop or a teaspoonful or, just a, a tablespoonful, some of these things can feel like we're drinking from the fire hose in terms of how it's filling up our cup. And just invite you to notice what sorts of things, if you were to shrink down and be really tiny and sit on your child's shoulder and go through their day, what kinds of things would you say, oh, that's something going on for them? That's something else going on as well. We also have in here for psychological factors, whether they feel responsible for the health and well-being of other people. And a lot of young teenagers feel very responsible for the health and well-being, not just of siblings sometimes, but of their own friends, right? They really lean on each other in terms of the support that they give each other. So this is why they have cell phones quite often in their rooms late through the night. If there was one thing that you were going to do today that was going to profoundly change your child's mental health, it would be to set a rule that, especially on school nights, there are no cell phones or devices allowed in their bedrooms, so that they can prioritize getting a good night's sleep and be able to respond and be present and all of these things, feel better able to cope with whatever's going to be happening for them the next day. In terms of social factors, their relationships with friends. Do they have friends? Sometimes even just having one friend in the world can make all the difference to us. And a lot of young people feel that their friendships are quite precarious. Do they have pure conflict, or are they being bullied at school? Do they have feelings of isolation, or do they have a sense of being part of a community? What is the weight of the expectations of others on them? We feel this as adults, so we know that our children feel this as well. Do they have a problem-saturated identity? And that means when they think of themselves, when they think of how other people view them, do they believe that other people see them as, a problem or a troublemaker? Or do they believe that other people see the fullness of who they are, their excellent sense of humor, and what a fantastic artist they are, and what a good friend they are, as well as having some problems with learning how to manage big emotions, right? Their sense of perceived helplessness. And this is an important one as well, because for a lot of kids, they're actually quite surrounded with supports and well-intentioned and loving family that really want to help them out. And yet their perception of being isolated or alone, or nobody understands me, nobody knows what I'm going through, is very real and profound. There is a normal developmental phase where that's appropriate for young people. And it's important that, we take into account how alone do they feel, which might be quite different from how alone are they actually in the world. What's their worldview? Is it more optimistic or pessimistic? And again, that perceived level of support and perceived helplessness. What do they feel is their capacity for being able to move through challenging things? So let's ask the question, why do some people become more overwhelmed than others? Because we might have three or four kids in our family who seem to cope quite well with different things, or at least they cope better. And we have one child that just goes off the rails or becomes quite explosive. And really, it comes down to, three possible factors, and these are really broad categories. One of these is their ability to manage the overflow in their cup. Some people just seem to filter through things, and it's just, they can just that release valve is there, and their cup never seems to become, or rarely seems to become, really, really full to capacity. But for some children, it's like it always feels like there's minimal room in their cup, and the least little thing creates an overflow. So that ability to manage overflow, and that can change across our lifespan according to the experiences that we've had before. There's that great quote in the Simpsons movie where Bart Simpson says to his dad, "Dad, this is the worst day of my life." And his dad says, "Oh, son, this is only the worst day of your life so far." Right. And I think that's actually a fantastic quote. I can't believe I'm quoting The Simpsons, but there it is, because it really shows that with experience, we actually learn that we can do hard things and we can get through hard times. And that develops and builds our sense of competency for when we are going through other hard things. For our children, this is often the first time they are going through something that is so difficult, so intense, so all consuming. The first breakup, the first crush, the first big exam they failed, the first assignment that they bombed, the first friend that's ignoring them. And so sometimes this is really quite difficult for them to have a perspective that only experience and a developing sense of competency can give them. Also, lacking emotion regulation skills, right? Being able to identify what is it I'm feeling and feeling able to cope with that. Some kids learn those skills, it seems like pretty effortlessly. They pick it up. Other kids, that's a harder struggle. In the same way that some kids need support learning how to read, and other kids seem to pick it up fairly easily. It is a developmental skill. And for some kids, they just require more coaching in terms of knowing how to cope with it. Another reason why some people become more overwhelmed than others is their ability to filter what is the stimulus that's coming at them and recognize, oh, that's not about me. That might be about the other person. Somebody's clearly having a bad day, but they just sort of take it all on themselves as though it's all about them. And if they don't have that ability to be cognitively flexible and look at things from different perspectives. If they're only looking at it in terms of that cognitive rigidity, it is this way. Um, that can really get in the way of them being able to filter through. And we see this a lot, not all the time, but we see it a lot where there is a diagnosis of neurodiversity, including ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. We see it where there can be other developmental disorders like learning disabilities or Fragile X syndrome or communication disorders or behavioral disorders or motor disorders, right? People who become frustrated much more quickly can really struggle with filtering out a lot of things. Where there's a history of trauma, sometimes that makes it harder as well to filter out and be objective, right? Be observational about what's happening. And again, that cognitive flexibility. The more we can see that there's more than one way to view a problem, the better the ability we have to filter through things. And finally, a third reason why some people have more trouble than others is some people are what we call super feelers. And a super feeler is someone who their baseline, I think they rev a little higher, is sometimes the way I describe that. And what that means is their baseline is a little more escalated than is typical for their peer group. It takes less of a problem or a situation for them to become more escalated than for somebody else within their peer group. And then it takes them longer to come down to their baseline. Super feelers, and some of the people are super feelers. Some of us are super feelers, right? The example that I give for super feelers to kind of understand that a little bit better is consider this Mini Cooper and also this big rig. Both of them follow the same rules of the road. You stop on the red light, usually. You go on the green and you stay in your lane and you signal to turn. And, all of us follow those exact same rules of the road. But the skill set required in terms of managing big equipment is completely different when you're driving downtown Vancouver on a Friday afternoon during rush hour, if you're driving a Mini Cooper, compared to if you're driving a big rig with two trailers, right? And when you have someone who is a super feeler, they are operating big equipment. And it takes longer to learn how to manage that equipment in a safe way, and in a healthy way. And so they're going to need more coaching. And something that feels like it's totally easy to someone else, like navigating a turn, to someone who's a super feeler, that feels dangerous and astronomical and terrifying and really, really, they can get quite panicky about managing that intensity of that emotion. So that's just another way of kind of looking at super feelers. So those three things together, our ability to kind of pour off, our ability to filter through what's coming in and what doesn't need to come in, and just how we experience stimuli coming in the first place, if we're a super feeler, all plays a role in terms of understanding this child, right? What's happening for this child? So now let's get down to brass tacks and talk about strategies. In the moment when that overflow happens and their cup is overfilled, don't add anything new to that cup, right? Really minimize your words. And often this is where we lean in and we try to be more logical and we try to reason and explain and we try to, whatever. And all of that is just adding more and more and more water. And sometimes that can escalate our child's emotion, because their capacity to cope has been overshot. If we step back and we just look at their behavior, we can see that, right? We don't even need them to communicate that to us. We can see that. So minimize your words, take a break, really reduce, the stimulus that's happening, step away, think of it like powering down, like nothing new here. We can dim the lights, we can turn off the TV, we can really start to create a lower stimulus environment. And we're going to model self-regulation. Above all, we're going to ensure safety. So if we need to remove younger or more vulnerable people from the room, or if we need to step away ourselves in order to ensure safety, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to model self-regulation, and we can be really, really explicit about that. We can say, oh, this is, what, like, I can see you're really upset. I'm just going to sit down over here and take a couple deep breaths because this is a lot. And I know that's a lot of words. Again, you know your child best. For some kids, real quiet and stepping back and just creating minimal stimulation is going to work best. For others, being able to say, this is what I'm doing. I'm not walking away from you. I'm not, abandoning you. I'm just going to sit down and I'm just going to breathe for a minute because I can see how big this is. That might be helpful for your child. The framework to think about is about inviting your child into your calm and not joining them into the chaos of that big emotion. So really, even if you don't say anything about it, let your child see you taking a couple big, deep breaths. And as much as possible, try not to do the eye roll, like, here we go again. While you're doing that, just get yourself really grounded and really calm. You want to invite them to model what you're doing, right? Because what we're requiring them in that moment, what we're really asking them to do is exactly what we want to model to them. When I feel overwhelmed, this is what I do. Right? So we don't want to match them in terms of the escalation. We want to get them to match us in terms of this is what we do when we feel this way. We validate the emotion always. I can see how angry you are. I get it. You're really angry. I can see how frustrated you are. Oh, that's really hard to feel disappointed. I know that's tough. That's really hard. When we don't know what the emotion is, we can use something called the 3 H's. That looks really hard. That looks really heavy. I can see that you're really hurting, right? Those 3 H's can be really helpful. We don't validate the behavior unless the behavior is adaptive and positive, right? So that doesn't mean we don't do anything about the behavior. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it just means we want to name for the child what is that emotion that we are seeing that they're grappling with in this moment. Let's name that emotion. It makes sense to me that you're feeling so angry. right, would be validating the emotion. It makes sense to me that you've just kicked your brother. No, that's the behavior, and we don't validate that ever, right? But it makes sense to me that you're so angry, and I'm not going to let you kick your brother. And so we move the brother out of the way, right? So validating emotion, that helps them put words to what's happening for them. Later, when things have settled a bit more, we're going to circle back. And again, for some families, this is going to be a really awesome thing. And for other families, oh no, this is not a conversation that you can ever have. And so I invite you, do what works for your family. Circle back and have a gentle startup in a conversation. And I've just given some examples here based on, a hypothetical scenario. An example of a gentle startup might be, hey, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I'm curious about how we can all handle that better next time. When we don't leave our child holding the whole bag for what happened, they're more inclined to lean in and say, yeah, I didn't like how you were in that moment either, and I didn't like how I was. Like, this is a shared problem now that we can all be working on together. Be curious about what happened for them. Tell them, I really want to understand what happened because it seemed like I missed it, or it seemed like I missed the mark. Make a really clear distinction between their emotions and their behaviors. Their behaviors are always welcome, are always valid. Or, sorry, the emotions are always valid and always welcome, but the behaviors might not be, right? So I could see that you were so angry, and we really need to figure out how you being angry doesn't mean that the iPad gets broken, right? Find out what they might have needed in that moment and encourage them to identify something that you can try next time, right? Did it make you feel better or worse when you went to your room? Or if they didn't, you could say, would it have helped if maybe you had been able to go to your room, or, something like that? And plan for the next time. These outbursts are not just a one and done scenario, they're going to happen again. So let them know some other things, other ideas that they might be able to try for next time. I wonder if and if you felt better when you left the room, that's great. Let's do what works. Let's plan that the next time when you feel so angry, you just go to your room, like before anything gets thrown. And I'm not going to get angry if you slam the door on your way. This actually gives the child a more adaptive thing to do. Nobody likes a slamming door, but we prefer a slamming door to a broken iPad. Let's get them moving one step in the right direction, right? Can we plan for that for next time, right? So this is that circling back. We're going to set a boundary, and this is where it gets, a little bit dicey sometimes for some families, is because we don't set a boundary around the emotion. We set a boundary around the behavior. And let's be really clear that a boundary is not a request. I don't want you to throw the iPad again is a request. It's not a boundary. The boundary is about creating predictability about how you are going to respond to the undesirable thing next time. It's just creates a roadmap and provides clarity. If this, then this. And a lot of parents sometimes say things like, it's like my child thinks that they can just do whatever they want. And the reality is they can. We can't physically restrain our children. And so, yeah, quite there, unless we move the iPad, there is really nothing that is going to stop them from picking it up and throwing it next time. But this is where we create the boundary that says, if you do that again, not if you get angry, right? The next time you're angry, if you throw the iPad or the phone or the toy or the remote or the whatever, I will not replace that item. That is the boundary. It creates that predictable roadmap. If this, then this. You remind them from time to time, lightly, casually, and then you follow through. And that follow through part is crucial. This is why we wait a little bit before setting this boundary, is circling back and setting the boundary. We never set the boundary or the consequence in the moment when we ourselves are so heightened, because we are going to lay down a boundary that we are not going to be able to reinforce, right? If you don't stop, I'm going to throw the TV out the window. Well, we're not really going to do that, right? If you don't stop, no TV or no cell phone for the next 6 months. Well, that might prove problematic and might not actually address the problem, right? So we never say the next time you get angry. You say the next time when you get angry, this is the behavior that's not going to happen. So that's why we're going to make a point of giving them other options of things they can do and reminding them of those things. We're really going to encourage proactive thinking about how they can care for themselves before they overflow. How do they notice that they're getting that close to an overflow? And what cues and clues have you observed that they might be able to be more watchful for? I've noticed that the anger seems to be hardest right after getting home from school. And I wonder if we can plan to have some quiet time or do things a little bit differently in that first half hour after you get home from school. Maybe have a snack or whatever. Maybe don't have screen time. Maybe not launch right into homework or chores. What happens if that first 30 minutes is just quiet time in the home? Do you notice that for that first half hour after getting home, that's when we tend to like, things tend to go nuclear. And we invite them to notice that about themselves so that they can be proactive participants in planning for their own emotion regulation needs. So that's sort of an idea about making sense about that behavior that we're seeing, why some kids struggle with this more than other kids, and some of the things that we can do in the moment and then later and then quite proactively. And through all of this, we are coaching them to just notice this about themselves, right? Notice not in a judgmental, we need to change this about you way, but in a way that says, hey, these big emotions are here. And so let's figure out how you do this, how you operate the big equipment in a way that is safe and that does not do damage to relationships or iPads or whatever the case may be.
Nicole, thank you. You've given us lots to think about. And I really appreciate how you spent some time helping us as parents really get curious about the why. Why is our child having such big emotions? And that we can then have compassion for them and self-compassion for ourselves. And without that understanding, I think it's really easy for us to jump to thinking there's a fix really fast. And I appreciate even more how you've shown us a road that we can go down. And there might be a stop here that we take and a stop over there that's going to be relevant to us. And that there isn't a one answer that we can give to families, but that they can start being curious and looking at these different ways that we can begin thinking about boundaries, thinking about being curious with our children, having those conversations with them. One thing I know is that sometimes parents, and I think back to my kid, he wasn't able to give us answers about why he reacted the way he did. So I want parents to be really kind of gentle with themselves when our kids can't do that, because some of our children have no idea why they were feeling the way they did. And when I look at their cups and how they're not always able to filter, we're not always going to get an answer easily. So that's where we have to have the compassion and the understanding before we step into that conversation with them, so that we can not have the expectation of them to know all the answers. Any
That's
final
exactly
thoughts
right.
that you want to share with families, Nicole?
Yeah. I just really invite, parenting is hard. It's really hard. And for a lot of families, by the time they're finding their way to Family Smart or therapy or family resources or whatever that looks like, they're already feeling like they're at the end of their ropes. And so I really want to, I wish that there were a really simple, straightforward, you do this, 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 and this, right? That families can just go, oh, okay, I can just do this. I wish that it were that easy. I would say if someone is promising you something that easy, though, they're not taking into account the unique complexity of your family and of your child and of you yourself as a parent. The solutions are not that simple. So being able to step back and matter of factly just observe, oh, their cup is overfilling. And once we start to think of it this way, we see this all over the place, right? We see it on TV, we see it in schools, we see it walking down the street, we see someone and we can just matter of factly go, oh, their cup is overflowing. Yeah, the capacity to cope has been overshot. And we can really step away from a lot of those narratives that are so hard on us and so hard on our kids, right? About what we should be feeling or how somebody else is able to cope better or differently or whatever. We can step away from that and we can just be matter of fact about it. And that helps us to answer the question of what does this child need in this moment, which is different from everybody else.
Thank you. And a great way to end. Just thinking back to that quote from Becky Kennedy, the only way we can regulate our feelings is by feeling the feelings. So thank you, Nicole, for sharing your knowledge and your heart with us. Thank you to our funders who make this work possible. But most importantly, thank you to all of you, parents and caregivers who have shown up to be with us today, taking the time to learn with us. We wish you all time to be able to discover what are the things that you can do and help with your own big emotions and your children's emotions in ways that feel supportive and connective. Thanks for being with us. Take care.